Medieval justice operated with terrifying speed, leaving the accused with minimal chance of an acquittal. Being caught in the act meant almost immediate punishment without lengthy and complicated legal proceedings. However, even the most cornered fugitive had one incredible way to save his life. This lifeline was the heavy wooden doors of absolutely any city church. In that era, religion wielded immense influence, capable of halting even the actions of a powerful royal army. Such a concept sounds like magic from modern fantasy, but back then it was a strict legal reality. This system created a unique social paradox right on the dirty streets of medieval cities. Desperate people lived for weeks inside the sanctuary under the personal protection of local clergy. People in the Middle Ages lived in a harsh world where punishments were incredibly cruel and final. Prisons, as we understand them today, simply weren't built, since keeping prisoners for many years was considered an unreasonably expensive endeavor. That is precisely why offenders were most often met with various physical mutilations or a swift execution in the town square. In such a situation, the only logical solution was to sprint as fast as possible to the nearest sacred place. The system of sanctuary functioned flawlessly in many major European states of the time. It was enough for a hunted person to run into a building to be completely safe from their pursuers. In some strict regions, the rules required one to run all the way to the altar and cling tightly to it with one's hands. From that moment on, the filthy and frightened lawbreaker became an inviolable guest of the powerful church. Pursuers had no legal right to simply walk inside and drag the person out by force. Such a brazen act was regarded as the gravest sacrilege, always followed by immediate excommunication from the church. Excommunication in those dark times meant absolute social death and the complete loss of all civil rights. Therefore, even the most ruthless sheriffs preferred to remain on the street, limiting themselves to loud threats against the criminal. But here is where the most interesting part of this historical mystery of medieval survival begins. The doors of large churches were never locked around the clock, so that anyone in need could find refuge there in the dead of night. Sometimes fugitives had to cover enormous distances through the forests, evading mounted patrols and hunting dogs. Modern Olympic marathon runners would envy the incredible endurance demonstrated by people under the fear of imminent execution. It is fascinating to observe how the crowd's behavior changed at the sacred threshold. Enraged townspeople, ready to tear a man to pieces a second ago, suddenly turned into law-abiding worshippers. The line between life and death literally ran along the stone step at the main entrance. This invisible barrier proved stronger than any fortress walls built by the best engineers of the time. Of course, the system was far from perfect, and tragic exceptions sometimes occurred. Impatient guards might hurl a spear at a fugitive as he ran up the steps, hoping to kill him before he crossed the line. Historical chronicles contain records of court proceedings where it was determined whether the slain person had managed to touch the door. The exact geolocation of the body determined whether the sheriff had administered justice or committed a terrible religious crime. Inside the temple, the fugitive was met by priests on duty, who were the first to assess the condition of the arriving guest. They were required to provide basic medical care if the person had sustained injuries during the long chase. Monks washed the wounds with a mixture of wine and vinegar, which served as a decent antiseptic long before the discovery of bacteria. Thus, the altar became not only a legal shield, but also a makeshift first aid station. The first few hours after arrival were the most tense for both opposing sides. The man lay breathing heavily on the stone floor, realizing that his life was safe for the time being. Outside, the sheriff organized a cordon, knowing that a long and exhausting war of attrition now lay ahead. A unique medieval procedure was about to begin, one for which there is virtually no parallel in modern legal practice. Once the criminal had successfully crossed the threshold, a completely new life, isolated from society, began. From the outside, the huge stone cathedral looks like a majestic building, but living inside it was incredibly difficult. Inside, a piercing cold reigned constantly as the thick walls kept the dampness locked in year-round. Fugitives had to sleep directly on the hard floor, using their own dirty clothes as a mattress. First and foremost, the clergy explained the strict internal rules of conduct to the newcomer. A violator was not allowed to carry any weapon, not even a small table knife. Any act of violence within the sacred walls immediately deprived a person of divine protection and inviolability. The church offered salvation, but demanded absolute obedience and impeccable peaceful behavior in return. Many people think that fugitives lived in the temple as honored guests on a full board. The reality turned out to be much harsher and resembled more a strict survival regime under extreme conditions. A criminal could not walk freely throughout the building. His movements were strictly limited to a specific area near the altar. Sometimes this area was separated by special benches, behind which it was strictly forbidden to go, under threat of being handed over to the authorities. The issue of food became the most pressing from the very first days of their stay in the refuge. The monks were not obligated to feed the criminals delicacies from their own church supplies. Fugitives were given the simplest food, consisting of stale bread and plain water. Modern nutritionists would call this extreme starvation, but for a medieval person, it was an acceptable price to pay for life. Modern temporary detention centers look like luxury hotels compared to the altar area. Constant darkness, cold stone, meager food, and the smell of unwashed bodies quickly broke a person's spirit. Fugitives suffered from severe paranoia, expecting armed guards to burst in every night. Restful sleep was impossible as people slept on edge, flinching at every creak of the wooden doors. The priest tried to maintain order by forcing the people in hiding to participate in daily prayers that lasted for hours. This served as a kind of payment for the protection provided and helped pass the endless, dragging hours. The recitation of prayers in Latin, which the criminals did not understand, turned into a monotonous and hypnotic process. Some people went mad from the constant stress and monotony, ultimately choosing to voluntarily face the executioner. Interestingly, large abbeys could simultaneously harbor several dozen dangerous criminals. Murderers, card cheats, and political dissidents sat shoulder to shoulder on cold stone benches. Unique social groups emerged, where former enemies were forced to coexist peacefully for the sake of their own survival. Any conflict within the group meant immediate expulsion onto the street, so the criminals behaved as quietly as water. Despite all the incredible hardships, the church remained the only safe place in the brutal medieval world. People endured the cold, hunger, and humiliation simply because the alternative was the gallows in the town square. Survival at the altar required tremendous fortitude, which modern people would hardly be able to demonstrate. It was not merely legal protection, but a true physical test of endurance.
We must secure the relics before dawn. The garrison is weak. We understand, Captain.
While the fugitive tried to settle into his modest life inside the church, no less dramatic events were unfolding outside. The local sheriff, having let the criminal escape, was obliged to organize round-the-clock surveillance of all exits from the building. The law strictly required the authorities not to let the offender escape. Otherwise, the entire town would be fined. Therefore, a makeshift camp of armed guards and curious onlookers quickly sprang up around the church. Often, ordinary townspeople were assigned to stand guard, pulling them away from their main jobs and family responsibilities. This caused immense discontent among the population, as no one wanted to freeze at night because of someone else's crime. The authorities' tactic was extremely simple, yet incredibly effective in the long run. They couldn't get inside, so they did everything possible to lure the man out through trickery. The guards loudly insulted the fugitive, threatened to harm his family, and spread false rumors. It was a true psychological war, methodically breaking down the nervous system of a man trapped within stone walls. Modern negotiators use similar methods of wearing down the opponent during hostage situations. The only difference is that medieval sheriffs weren't trying to save a life. They wanted to take it. Sometimes the authorities resorted to outright trickery, disguising their men as monks or relatives of the fugitive. The goal was singular: to force the victim to take even a single step beyond the invisible line of safety. The night hours posed a particular danger, when the priest's vigilance was slightly dulled by fatigue. Guards might try to pull a sleeping person out through an open window using long hooks. This was not considered a direct violation of church boundaries, since the soldiers' feet remained on secular ground. Such legal loopholes forced the fugitives to sleep as far away as possible from the cathedral's walls and windows. The standoff often escalated into open verbal altercations between the armed guards and local clergy. The clergy defended their right to sanctuary by threatening the soldiers with eternal damnation and the torments of hell. The guards, in turn, accused the church of aiding murderers and harboring dangerous bandits. This conflict of interest perfectly reflects the eternal struggle between spiritual and secular authority in the Middle Ages. It sounds illogical, but sometimes the townspeople themselves helped the criminal escape right under the authorities' noses. If the convict was popular with the people, the crowd might stage a diversionary brawl on the other side of the square. In the ensuing chaos, the fugitive would be handed a cloak with a deep hood, and he would vanish into the night streets. Such incidents drove the sheriffs into indescribable fury, but proving the crowd's complicity was practically impossible. However, more often than not, the siege ended in victory for the authorities, who simply had more resources and time. Hunger, cold, and constant fear took their toll, forcing a person to seek any means of salvation. When the mine finally broke, the criminal was ready to enter into dialogue with those who wished for his death. It was at this very moment that the next most difficult stage of medieval justice began. The siege of the church clearly demonstrated just how resource-intensive the law enforcement system was in those days. Modern police use cameras and helicopters, but back then they had to sit for weeks in the mud under the rain. This grueling process served as an excellent lesson for all the city's residents, demonstrating the inevitability of punishment. No one wanted to be in the shoes of either the trembling fugitive or the freezing night watchman. The daily routine of a man in hiding was not particularly varied or comfortable. Each new day began with the first rays of the sun, when the cathedral opened its doors to the congregation. The fugitive was forced to hide in dark corners so as not to disturb the worshippers with his presence. Being constantly in plain sight of hundreds of strangers placed enormous psychological pressure on his mind. The main problem remained the regular supply of fresh drinking water and nutritious food. The church's supplies were not unlimited, and the monks had no intention of spending them on criminals. If a person had no wealthy relatives, he had to literally survive on breadcrumbs. Many fugitives rapidly lost weight, turning into living skeletons in just a few weeks of isolation. Modern researchers often wonder how people survived at all in such unsanitary conditions. The lack of proper toilets and the inability to wash led to the rapid spread of skin infections and parasites. Lice and fleas became the outcasts' constant companions, driving them to distraction with unrelenting itching. There was nothing to treat these ailments with, so people simply had to endure the pain and discomfort. An interesting way for the criminals to obtain food was a peculiar form of begging inside the temple itself. The fugitives asked for alms from wealthy parishioners, appealing to their Christian sense of pity and compassion. Sometimes this actually worked, and compassionate townspeople would secretly pass them pieces of roasted meat or cheese. Such an unpredictable diet helped them hold on for a few more days while awaiting the final decision on their fate. But physical suffering was only a small part of the nightmare the fugitive endured. The complete lack of information about the outside world drove even the toughest and most cold-blooded gangsters mad. A person did not know what was happening to his family, whether his property had been confiscated or whether his loved ones were alive. This information vacuum was more terrifying than any torture, forcing the mind to conjure up the most horrific scenarios. Clergymen periodically tried to save these people's souls by holding long, instructive conversations with them. Monks persuaded the criminals to sincerely repent for their deeds and accept any future punishment with humility. To modern ears, this sounds like psychological abuse, but at the time it was considered the highest act of mercy. The church sincerely believed that physical suffering purified the soul before its inevitable meeting with the Creator. During long hours of idleness, fugitives often carved their names into the stone walls near the altar. These small inscriptions can still be found in some Old English and French cathedrals. They stand as silent witnesses to the despair of hundreds of people whose lives were forever changed within these walls. Every scratch on the stone represents hours of exhausting fear and hope for a miraculous salvation. Sometimes conditions became so unbearable that criminals chose to commit suicide right inside the church. Such an act was considered a terrible sin and a desecration of the holy place, requiring a complex ritual to purify the altar. To prevent this, the priests were forced to keep watch not only on the doors, but also on the fugitives themselves. Paradoxically, the sanctuary turned into a strict prison, with the clergy serving as its guards. Survival under such conditions required not only physical strength, but also incredible psychological resilience. Those who did not break down in the first few weeks gradually adapted to the cold, hunger, and constant fear. They became like ghosts, gliding silently through the dark naves of the medieval cathedral. Their old lives were irrevocably destroyed, and their new ones depended on the outcome of complex legal negotiations. While the fugitive fought for survival within the walls, tense diplomatic negotiations were taking place on the church porch. The head of the church, or a local influential bishop, automatically became the criminal's chief defender. On the other side stood the sheriff or the king's representative, demanding the immediate extradition of the dangerous lawbreaker. This dialogue resembled a complex chess game where human lives and political influence were at stake. Representatives of secular authorities often tried to use blatant blackmail and economic pressure against the clergy. They could cut off food supplies to the monastery or forbid parishioners from making generous monetary donations. In response, the priests threatened to excommunicate the entire city council, which would paralyze the city's life. This was a classic confrontation between two powerful bureaucratic systems of the Middle Ages. The Church's main argument always remained mercy and every Christian's right to sincere repentance. Priests argued that the secular court was too harsh and did not give a person a chance to redeem their soul. Government officials reasonably pointed out that showing mercy to murderers would lead to a rise in crime on the city streets. Both positions had logical grounds, which made the process of finding a compromise incredibly long and complicated. Sometimes the victims' relatives would secretly intervene in the negotiations, offering the sheriff huge bribes to speed up the process. Blood vengeance remained a powerful motivator, and the families of the victims craved immediate and brutal retribution. They might hire provocateurs who tried to lure the fugitive out with false promises or forged letters. In such a toxic atmosphere, priests had to act not only as diplomats, but also as counterintelligence agents. Interestingly, the fugitive's status played a decisive role in the outcome of these tense negotiations. If an ordinary peasant who had stolen a loaf of bread was hiding in the church, the parties quickly agreed on a light punishment. But if a noble knight accused of treason was sitting at the altar, the stakes soared sky high. In such cases, representatives of the king himself and papal legates often joined the negotiations. In the course of these disputes, unique legal precedents emerged that shaped the future of European law. Every decision was meticulously recorded in court scrolls by scribes from both opposing sides. These documents demonstrate just how flexible and pragmatic the medieval justice system could be in practice. The law was not a blind monolith. It adapted to the specific political and social conditions of the era. Sometimes negotiations reached a complete impasse, and neither side was willing to yield. In such stalemates, the sheriff might attempt to wear down the church by organizing a complete food blockade. Soldiers blocked all entrances and exits, not even allowing carts with ordinary firewood to pass through. This was a serious violation of unwritten rules, but desperate officials were willing to risk their positions. Ultimately, a compromise was almost always reached, since an endless siege was not in anyone's interest. The church did not want to feed a stranger forever, and the treasury could not indefinitely pay for the work of night watchmen. The parties agreed on terms of surrender that allowed everyone to save face before the crowd of townspeople. For the fugitive, this meant the end of the period of invisibility and a transition to the official legal procedure of repentance. This diplomatic dance at the threshold of the church saved hundreds of lives, replacing the death penalty with alternative punishments. The system worked precisely because of the balance between fear of the king and fear of divine wrath. As soon as one of these forces gained an absolute advantage, the right of asylum began to rapidly deteriorate. But during the heyday of the Middle Ages, this balance was maintained with astonishing and frightening precision. English law strictly regulated the time a criminal could spend under the protection of the church altar. A fugitive was granted exactly 40 days to reflect on his situation and make a final decision. This period had deep religious significance, referring to the biblical 40 days Christ spent in the desert. The state gave the person a symbolic time to purify themselves of their sins before the inevitable encounter with justice. The countdown began the very moment an official representative of the authorities recorded the criminal's presence inside. The local coroner, a special official of the crown, was required to come personally to the temple doors for the identification procedure. He recorded the fugitive's name, his crime, and the exact date marking the start of the 40-day period of salvation. This bureaucratic precision is striking, given the general chaos and confusion of everyday life in the Middle Ages. During those 40 days, the lawbreaker had only two legal options. The first option involved voluntarily surrendering to the authorities and hoping for a fair but harsh secular trial. If the person was truly innocent, they had a slim chance of proving it to a local jury. However, the statistics on acquittals in those days were close to zero, so this option was rarely chosen. The second option was more radical, but guaranteed the preservation of what was most precious, one's physical life. A person could officially admit their guilt before the coroner and ask for permission to leave the kingdom forever. This was a procedure of voluntary exile, which replaced the death penalty by hanging with lifelong deportation. For many proud people, the loss of their homeland seemed worse than death, but the instinct for self-preservation usually prevailed. Modern psychologists would call these 40 days the ideal mechanism for coercing a full confession. A hungry, frozen, and frightened man sat in a dark church, listening to the taunts of soldiers outside. Isolation broke any will to resist, forcing people to agree to whatever humiliating conditions the authorities imposed. The justice system did not seek the truth. It sought a quick and cheap resolution to the criminal case. Sometimes fugitives tried to use the time allotted to them to organize a clever nighttime escape. They bribed guards through relatives or tried to dig a tunnel through the old stone cellars of the church. But the sheriffs were well aware of all these tricks and doubled the number of patrols in the final days of the sentence. An escape attempt was considered a separate serious crime, for which one was hanged without further ado. By the end of the fourth week in the prison, most people were in a state of deep depression. They lost touch with reality, spent hours praying in tears, or fell into complete apathy. The priest began actively preparing the fugitive for the confession procedure, explaining all the legal intricacies to him. The monks acted as pro bono public defenders, persuading their client to choose life over a senseless death. On the 39th day, the tension surrounding the church reached an all-time high. A crowd of townspeople gathered in the square, anticipating a free spectacle and the dramatic denouement of this protracted saga. Guards checked their weapons, preparing for a possible assault if the criminal refused to come out voluntarily. The fugitive himself spent his last night in tears, bidding a final farewell to his former life. When morning of the 40th day arrived, the coroner solemnly approached the cathedral's massive doors with a scroll. He read the accused's name aloud and demanded an immediate response to the crown's offer. At that moment, a ringing silence filled the cathedral, broken only by the heavy breathing of the doomed man. The most humiliating and public stage of the medieval procedure for saving one's own life was about to begin. After taking the humiliating oath, the most physically grueling stage of the punishment began for the condemned man. The exile, clad in a simple canvas shirt and barefoot, set out on his long journey on foot toward the sea. In his hands, he clutched a wooden cross, which was meant to protect him from attacks by passers-by. This cross served as a visual marker, screaming to everyone around him about the status of this powerless man. The law required the exile to travel exclusively along the main royal roads, without veering into the woods. Any attempt to leave the road and hide in the bushes was considered an attempt to escape. An armed mounted guard often rode behind the man to ensure compliance with these harsh conditions. A single step off course meant immediate death by arrow or heavy knight's sword. Modern tourists traveling through England by car can hardly imagine the scale of this journey on foot. The journey to the designated port could take anywhere from a few days to several agonizing weeks. A person walked through pouring rain or under the scorching sun, rubbing their bare feet raw on the rocks. At the same time, they were strictly forbidden from stopping for more than one short night's rest. Finding food along the way was yet another extreme survival challenge in the wilderness. The exile had no money, so he was forced to beg for alms from passing merchants. Local peasants often refused to share food with a branded criminal, fearing the wrath of the authorities. People literally subsisted on roots and dirty water from roadside puddles, rapidly losing their last reserves of strength. If a person failed to reach the port within the time limit set by the coroner, he was declared an outlaw. From that moment on, anyone who encountered him could kill him without any legal consequences for themselves. This forced the outcasts to flee with their last ounce of strength, despite bloody blisters and physical exhaustion. The fear of becoming a defenseless target for bandits drove them forward more effectively than any whip. Interestingly, the church continued to provide minimal support to these unfortunate souls even along the way. An exile had the right to stop for the night on the grounds of monasteries encountered along his arduous route. The monks gave him a piece of bread and allowed him to sleep on a straw in a barn. However, at dawn, he was required to leave the premises immediately so as not to violate strict royal decrees. Residents of the villages through which the route passed often came out to watch this strange procession. For the peasants, a barefoot man carrying a cross was a kind of free entertainment and a source of gossip. Sometimes the crowd would start throwing stones at the exile, simply for the sake of cruel medieval amusement. Guards usually did not intervene until the stones directly threatened the life of the prisoner being escorted. There were times when the designated port turned out to be completely closed due to bad weather or war. In such a situation, the exile was required to wade knee-deep into the water every day at high tide. He had to stand in the cold water and shout, urging passing ships to take him aboard. This absurd rule demonstrated the medieval bureaucracy's fanatical commitment to adhering to formal laws. If no ship appeared within 40 days, the man could return to the nearest church. There, the entire procedure began anew. Another 40 days of isolation, a new oath, and a new journey. But this happened extremely rarely, as most captains were happy to take on free labor. The exile was willing to work as a laborer simply for having crossed the state border. The road to the port was the final chord in a symphony of humiliation and pain for the condemned man. By the time he arrived at the pier, he had become an emaciated, filthy, and broken shadow. His homeland saw him off with kicks and mockery, erasing his name from its official records forever. Ahead lay an unknown foreign shore and a lifetime of utter uncertainty. When the ship finally cast off from the pier, the exile looked at his native shore for the last time. Legally, he was no longer English or French. He was becoming a man without a homeland or a flag. Crossing the maritime border signified the successful completion of the deportation process and the preservation of his physical life. However, the joy of salvation was quickly replaced by dread of a completely uncertain future on the continent. Captains of merchant ships often disembarked such passengers at the first major European port they came upon. Flanders, Normandy, or the Spanish lands became a new, cold home for hundreds of former criminals. Local authorities knew full well who these ragged people with strange brands on their hands were. They were treated with contempt and suspicion as potentially dangerous criminal elements. Looking for work in a foreign land without knowing the local language turned into a nearly impossible mission. The exiles had to take on the hardest and dirtiest labor, cleaning cesspools or hauling stones. Former knights and wealthy merchants found themselves at the very bottom of the social hierarchy of a foreign country. Pride was a luxury these people could no longer afford in exchange for a piece of bread. Many of them eventually joined the mercenary bands that were constantly at war in a fragmented Europe. In the army, no one asked about your past if you knew how to wield a heavy sword. The exiles became the fiercest warriors, as they literally had nothing left to lose in this world. A mercenary's life was short, but it provided food, clothing, and the illusion of belonging to a group. Modern migrants often face difficulties adapting, but at least they are protected by human rights. A medieval outcast had absolutely no rights. Any local could cheat or kill him. The police would not have investigated the murder of a stranger with a brand on his finger. Surviving in a foreign land required incredible resourcefulness and criminal skills, which many quickly developed. Some exiles tried to secretly correspond with their families, who remained in their homeland in poverty. Letters were passed through merchants and smugglers for huge sums of money, risking discovery by the authorities. If such a letter was intercepted, the family could be accused of colluding with a state criminal. Therefore, contact was often severed forever, leaving people in agonizing ignorance of their loved one's fate. There are isolated historical instances where kings declared broad amnesties for all exiles. This usually occurred after devastating wars or epidemics, when the state was desperately short of labor. Those who survived and managed to return often found their homes destroyed and their wives married to others. Returning home did not bring the expected happiness, but only reopened old painful wounds. For the most part, exiles died quietly from disease, alcohol, or stab wounds in port taverns. They were buried in unmarked graves outside consecrated church cemeteries, like vagrants and suicides. The system successfully got rid of the problem by literally sweeping the trash outside the walls of the state. The right of asylum saved the body from the gallows, but slowly killed the person's soul far from home. This harsh medieval practice persisted for several centuries until society changed its views on justice. States became strong enough to build prisons and control religion within their territories. The need for diplomatic maneuvering at the church altar faded, giving way to strict codes and a professional police force. The era when a wooden door could stop a royal army is gone forever. Today, we can only marvel at the strange mix of cruelty and mercy that was the Middle Ages. People devised complex legal mechanisms to give each other a chance to survive in inhuman conditions. The right of asylum is a perfect example of how society tries to find a balance between vengeance and forgiveness. And although the price of this salvation was horrifying, many preferred to pay it in full. The history of the right of asylum vividly demonstrates humanity's incredible ingenuity when it comes to legal survival. Medieval people created a unique system of checks and balances, where the church served as a powerful buffer against state violence. This was not merely an expression of religious mercy, but a complex political tool that helped avoid endless, bloody uprisings. Thick monastery walls saved thousands of lives, albeit at the cost of eternal shame and the loss of one's homeland. Modern society has long since abandoned such practices, transferring the monopoly on justice to secular, independent courts. Today, a criminal cannot simply run into the nearest church and demand diplomatic immunity from the police. However, the very concept of protecting a person from immediate punishment has become the foundation of modern human rights. The right to a fair trial and a lawyer is a direct evolution of that very desperate dash to the church altar. Looking back, it is difficult not to feel mixed emotions about this harsh historical era and its laws. On the one hand, the cruelty of the expulsion procedure and the inhumane conditions of detention inside cold cathedrals are striking. On the other hand, it commands respect that in a world of total violence, there existed a guaranteed mechanism for salvation. This system shattered lives and destroyed families, but it left people with the most important thing, the chance to take their next breath.